What happened in Thessalonica that almost cost Paul his life? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 17, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 17, beginning at verse 1. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went in to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded became envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus." And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. As we come to chapter 17, we find that Paul, Silas, and Timothy are leaving Philippi, where much good work was done, in that Lydia and her household, as well as the jailer and his household, have now obeyed the gospel, leaving a good nucleus of Christians there for the gospel to spread from. From the pronoun change of verse 1, it appears that Luke, who has been present with the group when they arrived at Philippi, has not gone with the group once they left. Perhaps he remained behind to help these new Christians grow. But whatever the case, he does not go on to the next 2 cities, which are Amphipolis and Apollonia, the first of which is about 50 kilometers or 30 miles southwest of Philippi. Apollonia is another 43 kilometers or 27 miles southwest of Amphipolis. This would have been more than a one-day journey to both places, with short stops likely in both places. So let's remember things like this as we read on through the stories. Thessalonica is the capital of Macedonia, and it is about 56 kilometers or 35 miles west of Apollonia, meaning that in total, Paul, Silas, and Timothy have traveled about 150 kilometers or 93 miles since leaving Philippi. Long journey indeed. Being in the capital of Macedonia, though, meant that this was a larger city, and theoretically a city from which the gospel could go out into the smaller neighboring towns without Paul having to visit each town. Remember, it's the job of each Christian to try and spread the gospel. So often today we think it's the job of preachers who get supported to do this work. Perhaps we may even use the book of Acts to convince us that this is true. And while it is true that preachers do have a role in spreading the gospel, our role is to not only teach the truth to the lost, but to equip Christians to be able to take the saving message of Jesus out for themselves. Now, yes, preachers devote more of their efforts to do this, and may travel farther to do this. But if the preacher is the only one attempting to teach the gospel, it's not going to go far. We need to talk to our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, and even strangers on the street. Ask to speak to them about Jesus. Invite them to church. Inquire if they would like to study the Bible. Anything to be able to get your foot in the door. For Paul, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath days, if a city had such, for he knew that that is where people gathered who should be willing to hear the message about Jesus. In Thessalonica, Paul spent 3 Sabbaths doing this. How he approached the subject was the same way he did in chapter 13, which was by going to the Old Testament scriptures that the Jews would have been familiar with in order to show that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the one who had to die for sins and be raised the 3rd day, as foretold by the prophets. And like it was in all the places that Paul had gone to thus far, some people were persuaded, a great number of which were devout Greeks, even among the leading women. The local church at Thessalonica was now born. But just because some believed didn't mean all believed, and those who didn't believe had the same attitude as those Jews in Antioch of Pisidia, one of envy and hatred. These Jews took some of the evil men of the marketplace in order to assemble a mob and set the city in an uproar. They wanted Paul to be brought out to them and presumably killed, so they besieged the house of Jason, one of the Christians in Thessalonica. And when they couldn't find Paul there, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, as saying that these men who have turned the world upside down have come here too, and Jason has harbored them. What is this message that has turned the world upside down? There is another king, Jesus, who must be obeyed. They claim that this was contrary to the decrees of Caesar, which of course it was not, for Jesus is not that kind of king. He is a spiritual king who rules from heaven. And saying that Paul and company were turning the world upside down shows us that the message of the gospel is not simply being confined to the cities Paul visits. People without phones, televisions, and email are aware of what is going on in the region, and Paul seems to be gathering a reputation. Now, of course, the gospel was turning the world upside down, for the message of Jesus is a message of repentance and return to God, the complete opposite message that the devil teaches us. But to the government of Rome, it should not have been a threat, even though rulers of the city were perceiving it as such, for they were corrupt sinners who did not want to be reminded about their own sin. The rulers of the city in Thessalonica didn't want to hear things like this going on in their city, because that might attract outside Roman attention, so they took a security from Jason and the rest and let them go. Taking security is a courtroom term, meaning that Jason and the others assured the court that Paul and Silas would conduct themselves civilly and not cause trouble. Whether this was done with money or something else is not quite clear. But one thing is for certain. For the sake of Paul and Silas' safety, they would need to leave Thessalonica for the time being. Where would they go next? We'll find that out, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 17, verses 10 to 15, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.